الله أكبر
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Before I get into my brief presentation, I just want to let you all know that if Dr. Jihad felt uncomfortable coming behind the stand of Aisha Brown, what do you think I feel like? I mean, literally, I would rather just walk on out and just do something else. Alhamdulillah, beautiful, wonderful presentations. And it's so encouraging to see our younger brothers and sisters grabbing the mantle that was presented by Malcolm and so many before us and carrying this forward into the future. I grew up in an apartheid state. It wasn't called apartheid back then. And for the most part, every state in the United States, whether we're talking about Mississippi, Louisiana, whether we're talking about Alabama, whether we're talking about Georgia, no matter how outwardly racist and how segregated the cities and states may have been in the South in the United States, they were never referred to as apartheid states, and they were nothing short of that. I grew up in a state that was often called Up South, which was in North Carolina. And when I was growing up in North Carolina, that most people didn't know, had the reputation of having the largest single number of racist groups in the entire South. Now, this was supposed to be a progressive state. And so, having the confrontation on a day-to-day basis in an apartheid environment, being black, being African American, was challenging. But I had an aunt that lived in the Bronx in New York. And my aunt loved two things more than anything else. Of course, God, but human beings and just things on this earth. My aunt loved the New York Mets when they were, I think they were established in about 1962. And she loved Malcolm X. And I used to spend summers with my aunt in New York. And it was a treasure trove for me to be able to have my cousins take me down on 125th and listen to the folks standing on the soapbox. I don't know whether I ever heard Malcolm down there or not. I don't know. But I heard very dynamic presentations, but my aunt insisted that on this particular summer in 1966, when the autobiography of Malcolm was first coming out, she insisted that you're not going anywhere until you read this book cover to cover. And because I was a reader, it didn't bother me. Okay, Aunt Lou, this is what you want, this is what I'll do. And so I read the book. It was such a page turner that I have to say that it transformed the direction in life that I had set for myself after reading this autobiography. And so I have this topic to discuss for a few moments. What would Malcolm do? 58 years after his assassination in the Audubon Ballroom, in front of an audience of over 400 people in broad daylight, with his wife present, with other dignitaries present there, other organizers present, that Malcolm was gunned down. No attempt to try to hide who was perpetrating this hideous act that would change changed the course of history in this country. He was gunned down. And I just want to say that we all owe a debt of gratitude to a brother by the name of Abdul Rahman Muhammad, who was originally from Rhode Island, but he went to school at Howard University. And if you've seen the documentary, Who Killed Malcolm X? And I think that it's still playing on Netflix. It's because of the tireless work, the relentless pursuit of who actually killed Malcolm, that now two of the persons who spent over 20 years in the penitentiary for the murder of Malcolm, that didn't have anything to do with it, that they were exonerated through the courts. One of them has already died. The other got a mega $1 million settlement. You can't get your life back, but it certainly helps when you get a few $1 million for the time served that you had done. But what we find ourselves, and we're looking 58 years later, and we're asking ourselves, what would Malcolm do? Of course, we don't know the answer to that. We know how Malcolm stood up for what he believed to be right, regardless of the circumstances, regardless who didn't like what he was saying, regardless of anyone who had a different opinion and would express their opposition against Malcolm. Malcolm had the personal constitution to speak his mind, to speak a word of truth. No, regardless of who may disagree with his opinions. You know, Malcolm during his time, and I find it kind of interesting, having grown up as a Malcolm lover, I find it interesting that in today's world, amongst the Muslims, that you can hardly find a single Muslim who would admit to being against the teachings of the life of Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X. Today it's common for even those in this room and those outside this room, you can cross the country from coast to coast. And you can hardly find a single individual who will say that I didn't agree with Malcolm. This guy was too radical. No one wants to take that public position today. But do you know that because of the positions that Malcolm had taken without apology and just in a most straightforward way, that when Malcolm was assassinated in February 21st, 1965, and I feel bad about saying this, but it's the truth, that when Malcolm was assassinated, that the so-called Orthodox or Sunni Muslim community in New York and across the country, up and down the eastern seaboard, that most Muslim men at that time, Orthodox Muslims, were afraid to even view his body, to pray janazah prayer, to prepare and shroud his body for burial. That was the reality in 1965 with the Muslim community across the country. Allah forgive me, I'm not trying to condemn every Muslim. But when, and you should all take advantage, leave here at some point and go to the bazaar and buy a book by the title of I Buried Malcolm X. The first edition was written in 1992 by Sheikh Hisham Jabber. And his son, Sheikh Imam Khalid Griggs, has written a revision of this book. The revision, the first edition was wonderful. This revision is really, really great. So I advise you, buy this book, I Buried Malcolm. And part of it describes the kind of terror and fear that the Muslims had in associating even in death with Malcolm X. And so, in the interest of time,
I'll just say a few things that historically, and then come to what would Malcolm do. This is just theoretical. All of us can have an opinion, and I'm just going to give my opinion. But I want to go through a couple of things. One of the most dynamic movements and impactful movements in the 20th century in the United States was the Civil Rights Movement, and then the Black freedom struggle that came after that Imam Jamil Al-Amin and others were a part of. And when we look at how the civil rights leaders at that time and how the civil rights organization dealt with Malcolm, he was particularly a fringe figure as it relates to the civil rights movement. A period of that time, he set himself apart because he felt that the tactics that were being employed, given the circumstances that black people in particular were living under, that the tactics were inappropriate for the conditions that they were facing. And so Malcolm, with all candor and bravery and courage, took a position that no, I'm not going to be satisfied with brothers and sisters being shot down in the street, being brutalized all over the South, being targeted by racist policemen. And he wasn't just talking about Muslims, he was talking about black people in general, and he was saying, I'm not satisfied with these tactics. They are not addressing, they are not getting to the core of the issue. And so Malcolm's solution were different kinds of solutions. You know about Malcolm, and I don't have time to get into it, but it was not one of just only demonstrations, demonstrating against the system of structural racism that existed in the country at that time. And so the civil rights leaders, he was lampooned, he was criticized, he was demonized through the press. Muslims, when he was alive, for the most part, were afraid to identify. I can remember a brother who was from New York City and moved down to North Carolina. And he was telling me stories. He was a little older than I was. And he said when he was in New York, Malcolm would be on the television quite a bit. And he said on just local news and local New York TV shows. And he said the first time he heard Malcolm speak, he was sitting in his aunt's living room watching television. And he said that what Malcolm was saying was just so different from what everybody else was saying at that time. He said he was afraid. He started looking over his shoulder at the front door. He was thinking that the police may come in and kick in the door and arrest him for just listening to somebody speaking in the manner that Malcolm was speaking. So I wanted to try to, so we don't just gloss over how significant it is in this moment in time that you and I gather to pay homage to Malcolm X, that you and I love this man the way that he's loved across the globe. Let me move a little quicker here. Brothers and sisters, I want to just suggest in closing just a few things, and this is just, I'm not going to say idle suggestion, but this is some things in the context of what would Malcolm do if he were somehow able to see what's going on. Who knows? He may be seeing everything in gender. He may know everything that's going on here on earth. But if he were to have some input beyond his legacy, if he were to just see what's going on and have advice, what would he say in coming back and looking at the condition of the Muslims and people of color in this world today? What would Malcolm say? And I think one of the first things would be he would be startled he would express his amazement at how Muslims today, 58 years after his martyrdom, are holding up his name, reading more than just books about his autobiography. I have to say, and it's just because I'm kind of a Malcolm freak, I literally have 52 books in my library about Malcolm. I have about 15 other books on my Kindle about Malcolm. You know, my wife thinks I'm a little fanatical, not just with Malcolm books, but with any kind of book. You turn my house into a library kind of thing. But Malcolm was self-taught, autodidactic. And so he learned and had the perspective that he had, not because he was being spoon-fed some kind of idea to try to program him as a Muslim leader, as a leader amongst black people. He was self-taught for the most part. I'm not trying to ignore the influence of the teachings of Elijah Muhammad and how that set him on a course and how that started the process of his thirst for knowledge. But for the most part, Malcolm was autodidactic. He was self-taught. So I think one of the things that Malcolm would have to comment on and try to impact is, why are these people, and especially these Muslims, why and how are they accepting of me now? And when I was alive, they wouldn't come near me. They were afraid to come near me. I don't want to just be repetitive, but I think we need to appreciate how, in spite of what the mass media has tried to impress upon us about, stay away from this man, he's a dangerous individual, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was reported to have said that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves someone on earth, he announces it to the angels. And he will tell them, I love that brother. I love that sister. Then the angels will go about through the heavens, passing the word, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves this brother and loves this sister. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will have the love that he has for that individual descend down to earth and place into our hearts. And so the only phenomenon that I can come up with is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loved Malcolm. He loved his sacrifice of his life, not for a political reason. He sacrificed his life knowingly so that the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be supreme in the African American and the global community. So I think Malcolm would at first have to address this phenomenon. I think also Malcolm would have to address a phenomenon that I don't even have an expression to try to characterize it, but it's a weird kind of thing. You can hear the most racist, right-wing, ultra-conservative politician in this country talking about what they are going to do, what they intend to do, and they're saying, by any means necessary. It's really sickening listening to the appropriation of an expression that kind of capsulized Malcolm's position. That's right. That by any means necessary. And one of the most insulting appropriations has come from Uncle Clarence. It's come from Uncle Clarence, the Supreme Court Justice. Clarence Thomas.
You've been timing for a minute. You've been timing for a minute.
Openly says that Malcolm was his hero. He talks about, literally, I'm not making this up, Uncle Clarence talked about how what gave me inspiration to do what I've done in my life was Malcolm X. How could that be?
How can that be?
How could that be? How could so many people that would be characterized, I'm not going to say Uncle Tom, it's not right to call somebody an Uncle Tom, but having some crazy mixed up views, I'll put it like that, who are African Americans, how in the world can they say that their inspiration comes from El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz? So I think this is another phenomenon that Malcolm would address. But I want to point out that one of the problematic areas, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, but one of the problematic areas that we find here in the United States today is that so many of our Muslim brothers and sisters end up accepting the kind of racist stereotypes of people of African descent. You don't know, maybe people just, because unless I'm just really running my mouth, I don't talk a lot. And lots of times people feel free to say things that I have good hearing. I can't see good, but I have radar ears. And I hear so many comments of our Muslim brothers and sisters speaking about African American Muslims in the way that the most racist Southern white person would talk about lazy and shiftless black people. That they can't get ahead because they're lazy. 300 plus years of slavery working for free. And you want to say, I'm lazy? All kinds of ideas and images and stereotypes of people of African descent today in this country, whether we be Muslim or not. The kinds of attitudes that our brothers and sisters have for us today is abhorrent. It's terrible. It's horrible. Malcolm went on Hajj on April the 4th, 1964. He went on Hajj still proclaiming the correctness of the beliefs of Elijah Muhammad. That he got into Hajj, he was permitted to make Hajj, he was treated as a special guest. But the reality is that he entered Saudi Arabia in April of 1964, still thinking that the teachings of Elijah Muhammad were the correct teachings and more relevant for struggling people of African descent in the United States. And while he was on this particular Hajj, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala transformed his understanding and transformed his spirit. So when he came back, even before he came back, he started writing these letters back home to his wife and members of Organization of African American Unity and Muslim Mosque Incorporated, telling them that I have changed. I know I've only been over here just a few weeks, but I've changed. I no longer believe that white people are by nature the devil.
Go ahead.
And he gave his reasons for saying, I've eaten with, I've prayed with, I've been all around all these blonde haired, blue-eyed brothers and sisters who in the United States would be called white. So I have to change. This was in 1964. After entering Saudi Arabia, believing that the black man was God, and that the white people as a race were collectively devils. So Malcolm, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gifted this brother to be able to see things and hear things and speak with others and transform his heart. And so when Malcolm came, even before he came back to the States, he was going around the Muslim world. He was going throughout the continent of Africa. Malcolm was growing into this beautiful figure that we honor here today. That his example was an example of an individual who, when recognizing what is truth, he was willing to not have any kind of pretense, not be too ashamed to admit that I was wrong. I taught you all for 12 years a wrong philosophy. And he was able to back away from it. So my question is, how is it in 2023, living in an information age where there's no excuse for every literate, any child, any man, any woman who can just read, living in this information age, there's no excuse for us to harbor foolish, racist ideas about our brothers and sisters of African descent in this country, or to harbor racist ideas about any people on the face of the earth. And so I feel certain, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. There's no way to have certainty on a projection. But I really believe that Malcolm would address this phenomenon. And I'll close on this particular point. That when Malcolm was coming back to the United States after his second trip and touring the Middle East and Africa, that Malcolm stopped in Geneva, Switzerland. And he went to the Islamic Center in Geneva, Switzerland. I'm going to just say this real quickly. I had the opportunity to go to the United Nations traveling with one of Imam Jamil's lawyers. And the emphasis was trying to internationalize Imam Jamil's case. That the traction was not what any of us had hoped in the United States at this point. So we went over there, we presented to the Human Rights Commission there at the United Nations in Geneva. And we met a lot of, I would say, prestigious people. But the crowning glory for me to go to Geneva, Switzerland, was to attend the Islamic Center there in Geneva, because Malcolm had gone and prayed in the Islamic Center there. And just so many years later, just following this little sunnah, I felt great about this. And when I came back home, they were asking me about the UN and the Human Rights Commission and all like that, and I'm talking about going to this little small Islamic center in Geneva that Malcolm had been to. As a matter of fact, when we came up, and one of the brothers, I think he was running a bookstore, and he stopped us before we got in, and he asked, "Are you from the States?" And we said, "Yeah." And he said, Malcolm prayed in this masjid. I said, you can tell that my brother, he may not know, but I know all about that. You don't have to tell me. That's why I'm here today, because of Malcolm to go to this masjid. But what we find, that when he was in Geneva, Switzerland, he met with Tariq Ramadan's father, Sayyid Ramadan. And Sayyid Ramadan was in exile from Egypt. He was a member of the Ikhwan Muslimin, the Society of Muslim Brothers in Egypt. And he was in exile. He was the director of the Islamic Center there in Geneva. And Sayyid Ramadan gave Malcolm 9 questions. And he wanted Malcolm to complete the questions before he went back to the States. So Malcolm couldn't complete all of them. He was just busy running around. And so he told Sayyid Ramadan, "I'll get back to the United States and I'll finish the questions." Malcolm's wife, Betty, said that on the night before his martyrdom, Malcolm was in a hotel room trying to complete, he wanted to honor his word, just said Ramadan. He was trying to complete these questions, and he completed the questions. One of the questions to me was very telling. And I'll close with this by saying that I think that the internationalism of Malcolm, his acceptance of Muslims all over the planet, his recognition that any of us have no value except of being, if it ain't about righteousness and submission to Allah, no matter what identification we have on our passport, no matter how much money we have or who we think we are, is nothing. And so one of these questions, and I'll try to get through this quickly, one of the questions was, Malcolm, and I'm paraphrasing, Malcolm, you are a very smart and wise man. You are now a part of the Muslim Ummah all around the world. How is it that you can continue to place so much emphasis on African American people when you know that this deen is a global deen? And rewording just not word for word, but what Malcolm responded was that I'm like a good farmer, that you fertilize the ground, and the part of the ground that is most fertile, this is where you plant your seeds first. Right. And then after you do that, then you go to the areas that require more work, digging in the soil and getting rocks out and all of this thing. And he said that the most fertile ground for Islam in the United States is in the black community. It's coming from the African American community. And this is what he was saying in 1965. And so Malcolm was saying that as long as the conditions exist the way that exists in the United States, I will continue to struggle and to fight for my brothers and sisters. And it didn't mean that he was doing it in some kind of nationalistic way. But he recognized that the gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him, that the nature of his own lineage demanded that he pay attention. And this is what I think Malcolm would confront us about today. That it's wonderful that we have a responsibility because like a single body, if one part of the body hurts, we all get a fever, we ache. And so we have to be concerned about every aspect, every part of this ummah. But there's no excuse, in my humble opinion, how we can live in the United States in an information age and ignore the plight of black people in this country. Let me give one example and I shut up. I'm out of your way. And I'm not saying this from any kind of racial intent, I'm just saying this from a consciousness, a level of consciousness. I humbly submit that if any of the race or nationality or ethnicity of children were being murdered by policemen in the streets, the way black children have been and adults have been murdered in the streets in the United States by racist killer cops, that there would be a kind of national emergency. There would be a state of emergency. This would have to stop. But I submit that because it's happening to black children, we are witnessing. And if you read history, you'll see that this phenomenon has been going on. With disregard for human life, whether you're a child, whether you're an adult. As an African American, this has been going on since the transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans. And so I believe that Malcolm, before he got out there talking to Joe, talking to Crazy Donald, and confronting these other issues, that he would survey our community and say, look, we got resources. This is the richest Muslim population on the face of the earth. This is the most educated population of Muslims on the face of the earth, and you can't seem to appreciate your responsibility as Muslims to address this element in our society. That's my way.